They're calling you greedy because you refuse to sign this away, Attorney Michael Harper said quietly, his hand resting on my grandfather's sealed envelope. Greedy. That was the word my own brother chose only hours after Grandpa Arthur's funeral. If I wasn't after his trust, then why was I asking so many questions? Why had Grandpa left one handwritten note that could only be opened after a family dispute? And why did the lawyer look as though he'd been expecting this exact moment for years? Then my mother leaned forward and said, "If you love this family, you'd stop embarrassing us." What none of them knew was that the envelope on the table wasn't about money anymore. It was about proving my grandfather had seen this betrayal coming long before any of us did. If you're watching from outside the US, I'd love to know what country you're in. If you're here in America, tell me your state, and while you're at it, share your local time in the comments. If stories about family truth and standing your ground resonate with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. For most of my life, my family liked to describe me with one sentence. "Quinn will figure it out." It sounded like a compliment when relatives said it over Thanksgiving dinner or during birthday parties. My mother always smiled with pride when someone praised my work ethic. My grandfather would nod quietly without saying much. But somewhere along the way, those 4 words stopped being praise. They became an expectation. By the time I was 34, I had become the person everyone called after the damage had already been done. I was a forensic accountant for a consulting firm in downtown Chicago. My job wasn't preparing tax returns or balancing family budgets. Companies hired me after something had gone wrong: missing money, suspicious invoices, inflated expenses, fraudulent payroll records, embezzlement. I followed financial trails the way detectives followed fingerprints. People often imagined my work as glamorous because television made financial investigations look exciting. The reality was much quieter. Hours of spreadsheets, thousands of emails, bank statements, contracts, electronic timestamps, digital signatures. You learned very quickly that people rarely destroyed every piece of evidence. Most lies weren't uncovered by finding one dramatic document. They unraveled because dozens of tiny details refused to fit together. Grandpa Arthur loved hearing about my cases, not because they involved money, because they involved people. "Money doesn't change character," he'd tell me whenever we sat together on his back porch. "It simply gives people more opportunities to show who they've already been." At the time, I thought he was talking about the executives I investigated. Years later, I realized he'd been talking about our family. My parents divorced when I was in college, but they never truly separated emotionally. Mom Evelyn Chavez still leaned heavily on Grandpa Arthur whenever life became difficult. She had worked hard most of her life as a dental office manager, but retirement hadn't been as comfortable as she'd imagined. Rising costs, unexpected medical bills, and Ethan's endless financial emergencies always seemed to arrive together. Then there was my brother. Ethan Chavez was 38, charming enough to convince almost anyone that his newest business idea would finally be the one. Over the years, he'd opened a landscaping company, then a sports memorabilia store, then an online retail business, then a commercial cleaning service. Every failure came with an explanation that wasn't entirely unreasonable. The economy, bad timing, a dishonest partner, supply chain issues, a difficult lender. Listening to him once you might believe him. Listening to him for 15 years, patterns became impossible to ignore. Grandpa never called Ethan lazy. He simply called him impatient. "I wants harvest before planting." Grandpa once whispered to me while Ethan enthusiastically explained another expansion plan over Christmas dinner. I laughed. Grandpa didn't. My younger sister Natalie was different. She wasn't reckless. She simply hated conflict. If agreeing with someone kept dinner peaceful, she'd agree. If changing the subject avoided tension, she'd change it. She often described herself as the peacemaker. Grandpa privately called her the weather vane. She always points whichever direction the strongest wind is blowing. Again, he wasn't being cruel, just observant. Every family develops invisible roles. Mine certainly had. Ethan was the dreamer. Natalie was the peacekeeper. Mom was the worrier. And I was the fixer. Need help understanding mortgage paperwork? Call Quinn. Someone forgot to pay property taxes. Call Quinn. Insurance denied a claim. Call Quinn. Need someone to review a contract before signing. Call Quinn. I never kept score. Honestly, I didn't think I needed to. Helping family felt normal, until helping quietly became expected. One February afternoon, Ethan showed up outside my office carrying 2 coffees. That alone made me suspicious. I usually called only when he needed something. I figured we could catch up, he said with an easy smile. We sat in a cafe across the street. For almost 20 minutes, we talked about baseball work and Grandpa's vegetable garden. Then he slid a folder across the table. There it is, I said. He grinned. You know me too well. Inside were financial statements from his newest company. I just need another pair of eyes. I spent half an hour reading. The business wasn't collapsing because of bad luck. It was bleeding cash because someone had categorized several large equipment purchases incorrectly, triggering penalties with one of his lenders. Who prepared these? I asked. My accountant. I circled several entries. If these are corrected immediately, you'll avoid default. His expression changed. You serious? I am. What do I owe you? Nothing. You spent your lunch break doing this. I know. I looked genuinely relieved. For a brief moment, I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe he'd remember. Maybe gratitude would last longer than the crisis. 3 weeks later, Mom invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. Halfway through dessert, Ethan announced proudly that his company had survived a difficult financial review. Everyone applauded. Mom hugged him. Natalie called him inspiring. No one mentioned why the company had survived. I wasn't expecting recognition. But when Mom smiled at Ethan and said, "You always find a way," I felt something inside me shift. Not because they forgot, because they genuinely never thought about it. Grandpa looked across the table. Our eyes met. I had noticed. He always noticed. A month later, Grandpa invited me to lunch at his favorite diner. He ordered grilled cheese. I ordered soup. For almost an hour, we talked about everything except money. Books, gardening, the Cubs, the neighborhood changing. Then he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Do you know what the most expensive thing you've ever given this family is? I laughed. I've never given them anything expensive. I shook his head. Yes, you have. I frowned. What? Your reliability. I didn't answer. He stirred his coffee slowly. When people become certain you'll always rescue them, they stop appreciating the rescue. I wanted to disagree. Instead, I remembered dozens of phone calls that always began the same way. I hate asking, "This should only take a minute." "I know you're busy." Every request sounded temporary. Together they had become years. Grandpa reached into his jacket and pulled out a small cream-colored envelope. My name was written neatly across the front. Quinn Chavez. He placed it beside my coffee but kept one finger resting on top of it. Don't open this unless Michael Harper tells you it's time. I looked at him confused. What is it? You'll understand later. I don't like mysteries. He smiled. I know. Is something wrong? No. Then why now? His smile faded just enough for me to notice. Because sometimes the hardest evidence to accept isn't about money. He slid the envelope toward me. It is about the people we love. I slipped it into my purse, never imagining it would remain unopened until the day my own family looked me in the eyes and called me greedy. I kept Grandpa Arthur's envelope exactly where he'd told me to. Not in a desk drawer, not in a safe. It stayed inside the fireproof document case I kept in the closet of my condominium alongside my passport, my professional licenses, and the original deed to my home. Every few months I'd see it while pulling out another document. The cream-colored paper had begun to yellow slightly around the edges. His handwriting remained unmistakable. Quinn Chavez. Nothing more. I thought about opening it more times than I cared to admit. But every time I remembered his exact words. Don't open this unless Michael Harper tells you it's time. If there was one person I trusted enough to honor a promise for years, it was my grandfather. So I waited. I just didn't realize what he had actually been preparing me for. Arthur Chavez built his wealth the slow way. No lottery, no lucky investment, no overnight success. I had started with a pickup truck, 2 employees, and a small residential construction company outside Chicago nearly 45 years earlier. When suburban neighborhoods expanded throughout northern Illinois, his company grew with them. I earned a reputation for something surprisingly simple. If Arthur Chavez promised a completion date, he met it. If he found a mistake, he fixed it before sending the bill. If a customer paid too much, he mailed the difference back. His competitors sometimes laughed at him for leaving money on the table. Grandpa would shrug. "You can always earn another dollar," he'd say. "You don't always get another reputation." By the time he retired, the company had become valuable enough to attract several buyers. I eventually sold it to a national construction group. The sale gave him more money than he had ever expected to spend during his lifetime. Instead of distributing the proceeds immediately, he established the Chavez Family Trust. At first, everyone assumed they understood what that meant, including me. During one Christmas dinner about 6 years before his death, Ethan raised a toast. "Here's to Grandpa," he said, lifting his glass. "The man making sure all his grandkids retire early." Everyone laughed. Even Grandpa smiled, but only for a moment. "You all seem very confident about something," he said. Ethan grinned. "About what?" "My trust." Natalie leaned forward. "Isn't that the whole point?" "Which part?" "That everything gets divided equally." Grandpa folded his napkin carefully before answering. "I don't remember ever saying that." The dining room became strangely quiet. Mom tried to lighten the mood. "Oh, Dad, don't tease them." "I'm not teasing anyone." Ethan chuckled. "Come on. Everybody knows that's how these things work." Grandpa looked directly at him. No. What do you mean?" "The trust isn't designed to make everyone equally happy." "It isn't. It was designed to protect what took an entire lifetime to build." No one asked another question, at least not that night. But I noticed something. Grandpa wasn't trying to create suspense. I genuinely wanted us to stop assuming we already knew his intentions. Most of us didn't listen. A few months later, he invited me to accompany him to attorney Michael Harper's office. I assumed he needed someone to help organize tax records. Instead, Michael greeted me warmly and said, "Arthur tells me you're the only person in the family who actually enjoys reading legal documents." "I wouldn't say enjoy." Michael laughed. "Close enough." Grandpa disappeared into Michael's office for nearly 2 hours while I waited in the reception area answering emails from work. When they finally came out, neither man looked stressed. In fact, they seemed relieved. Grandpa introduced me properly. "Quinn Michael has been putting up with me for almost 20 years. Michael smiled. "Your grandfather has revised his trust several times." I looked at Grandpa. "Everything okay?" He answered without hesitation. "Everything's exactly as it should be. That should have been the end of it." Instead, Michael added something that stayed with me. "Your grandfather never changes anything quickly." Grandpa chuckled. "I've never trusted fast decisions." Michael nodded. "Every amendment is documented." Grandpa added. "Every question answered." Michael continued. "Every signature witnessed." Then Grandpa finished the thought. "And every decision made while my mind is perfectly clear." At the time, it sounded excessive. Years later, I understood exactly why every safeguard mattered. As my career advanced, I became increasingly fascinated by how ordinary people misunderstood trusts. Friends occasionally asked for advice. One afternoon, a coworker asked whether rich families simply used trusts to avoid taxes. I explained it as plainly as I could. "A trust isn't just a pile of money." "What is it then?" "It's a legal structure." "So, like a will?" "Not exactly. A will says who receives property after someone dies." "And a trust?" "A trust can include instructions." "What kind?" "How money should be managed when someone receives it." "What conditions apply?" "Who oversees everything?" And most importantly, what? It reduces the chance that emotional family arguments will determine what happens. That conversation came back to me often after Grandpa died, because he hadn't built the trust to control us. He'd built it because he knew emotion could overwhelm judgment. Over the next several years, Ethan became increasingly interested in Grandpa's estate. Not openly, never directly, just little comments. I hope Grandpa finally takes it easy. I wonder who'll keep the lake cabin. I hope nobody has to sell the family house. One afternoon, while helping Grandpa replace a broken fence post, Ethan casually asked, "So, who's the trustee?" Grandpa smiled without looking up. "Someone qualified." "Is it Quinn?" "No." "Who then?" "The person I selected." Ethan laughed awkwardly. "You always answer questions without answering them." Grandpa returned to hammering the post into the ground. Sometimes curiosity isn't looking for information. It's looking for reassurance. And sometimes reassurance isn't deserved. I noticed Ethan's smile disappear. About 9 months before Grandpa passed away, Mom invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. The conversation somehow drifted toward inheritance. Natalie insisted families should never fight over money. Ethan agreed immediately. "We're better than that." Mom nodded. "Our family would never tear itself apart over an estate." Grandpa quietly set down his fork. "I sincerely hope you're right." Ethan reached across the table. "You don't have to worry." Grandpa studied each of us for several long seconds. Then he asked one question. "If tomorrow you discovered the trust wasn't what you expected, would your love for each other change?" Nobody answered. Not because we didn't want to, because none of us had expected the question. Grandpa finally smiled. "I suppose we'll never have to find out." Looking back now, I don't think he believed that for a second. About 3 weeks before his death, I stopped by his house after work. I looked tired, older than he had only a month earlier. But mentally, he was as sharp as ever. We spent the afternoon organizing boxes in his study. As I carried one stack of folders toward a cabinet, I noticed a leather portfolio sitting on his desk. Its cover bore the embossed logo of Harper & Cole. Before I could say anything, Grandpa gently closed it. "Business." I nodded. I wasn't trying to read it. "I know." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something that made no sense until much later. "Quinn, if people ever question your integrity, don't defend yourself too quickly." I frowned. "Why?" "Because people determined to misunderstand you rarely change their minds from explanations." "So what changes them?" He rested one hand on the portfolio. "Evidence." I smiled. "That's exactly what I tell my clients." "I know." He smiled back. "I learned it from watching you." That was the last real conversation we ever had. 3 weeks later, he was gone, and only after his funeral did I remember the leather portfolio. When my brother casually mentioned something that made my stomach tighten. "I was actually the last one Grandpa met with before he passed," Ethan said. Everyone at the conference table looked at him, including attorney Michael Harper. But unlike the rest of us, Michael didn't look surprised. No one spoke for several seconds after Ethan made that announcement. "I was actually the last one Grandpa met with before he passed." The conference room suddenly felt smaller. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, but it did nothing to cut through the tension settling around the polished walnut table. Mom looked at Ethan with surprise. "You never mentioned that." He shrugged as if it were an insignificant detail. "It didn't seem important." I turned toward him. "When?" He leaned back in his chair. "About 4 days before he died." "You visited him?" "Yeah." "At the house?" "Of course." "What did you two talk about?" He smiled, but it wasn't quite natural. "Oh, you know, family." It was the kind of answer that technically responded to the question while revealing absolutely nothing. Normally, I would have let it go. Not because I believed him. Because I had learned that people who weren't telling the whole truth usually volunteered more information if they weren't interrupted. Instead, Mom jumped in. "I'm glad you spent time with him." Ethan nodded. "Me too." Attorney Michael Harper quietly closed the trust binder in front of him. "We'll return to the distribution shortly." His tone remained professional, but I noticed something almost imperceptible. His eyes rested on Ethan for perhaps 1 second longer than necessary. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. Observation wasn't a habit anymore. It was instinct. That evening, after leaving the law office, I drove home through downtown Chicago in complete silence. The radio stayed off. Traffic crawled along Lakeshore Drive while my mind replayed the conversation again and again. Not Ethan's words, his timing. If he really had been the last family member to see Grandpa Arthur alive, why had no one known? Grandpa and I usually spoke at least once every week, sometimes only for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. I had never mentioned Ethan's visit. That alone wasn't suspicious. People were entitled to private conversations. But something about Ethan's delivery bothered me. I hadn't offered the information naturally. I had almost tested the room, as though he wanted to see everyone's reaction. Those tiny differences mattered. In fraud investigations, people rarely lied by inventing elaborate stories. They lied by controlling when information appeared. Timing often revealed more than words. The following morning, I arrived at work before 8. Our office occupied the 23rd floor of a glass building overlooking the Chicago River. By 9 o'clock, I was supposed to begin reviewing expense reimbursements for a manufacturing client. Instead, I kept staring at my computer without reading a single page. Finally, my coworker and closest friend Maya Reynolds knocked lightly on my office door. "You've looked at the same spreadsheet for 15 minutes. I smiled weakly. "Has it been that obvious?" "You highlighted the same cell 3 times. She sat across from me. "Funeral." I nodded. "Family." Another nod. She waited. Maya had one quality I deeply appreciated. She never rushed silence. Eventually, I told her everything. Not about the money. About the accusation. About being called greedy. About the sealed envelope. About Ethan claiming he was Grandpa's last visitor. When I finished, Maya folded her arms. "So what bothers you most?" "The conversation. With your brother." "No." "The timing." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "In investigations, facts matter. Obviously. But chronology matters just as much." "Explain." "If someone's story is accurate, the sequence usually stays consistent. And if it isn't, the order starts changing." Maya nodded slowly. "So what sequence changed?" "I don't know yet. But something doesn't fit." At lunchtime, I opened the notebook I always carried. Most people use digital notes. I still preferred paper. Grandpa had teased me about it. Some habits survive technology. Across the top of the page, I wrote one question. Timeline. Then I began reconstructing everything I knew. Grandpa's routine during his final month. Hospital appointments. Church service. Lunch with me. His weekly card game. Attorney Harper's office. The funeral. The trust meeting. Nothing dramatic. Just dates. Times. Locations. Tiny details. The same way I approached every investigation. Not looking for guilt. Looking for gaps. When I finished, one space remained frustratingly blank. 4 days before Grandpa died. Exactly where Ethan claimed they had met. There was no supporting detail. No phone call. No family text. Nothing. That still wasn't evidence. It was only an unanswered question. Professional experience had taught me never to confuse those two things. That evening, Mom called. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay. I know yesterday was difficult." "It was." She hesitated. "Quinn." "Yes." "I wish you hadn't argued about the trust." I closed my eyes. I wasn't arguing. "You questioned it." "I asked Michael to follow Grandpa's written instructions. It upset everyone." "Mom." "No, just listen." Her voice softened. "Ethan's already under so much pressure." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was painfully familiar. Somehow the conversation had already shifted. Not toward whether Grandpa's wishes should be honored. Toward Ethan's feelings. What pressure? His business is finally stabilizing. I'm glad. He really needs this inheritance. I looked out my apartment window. The Chicago skyline glowed against the evening sky. "Mom, do you hear yourself?" "What?" "You just assumed he needs it more than anyone else." "You don't." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" The trust isn't supposed to reward whoever has the biggest problems. Silence. Finally, she sighed. I just don't want this family torn apart. Neither did I. The difference was, I wasn't the one pulling against Grandpa's final instructions. The next afternoon, my phone rang again. Attorney Michael Harper. Miss Chavez. Michael, I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. I wanted to clarify something from yesterday. I'm listening. There seems to be confusion regarding your grandfather's final meeting. I sat straighter. What kind of confusion? I can't discuss privileged conversations. I understand. But I can clarify dates. My pulse quickened. Okay. Your grandfather met with several people during his last week. I assumed that. There was one meeting at his home. Ethan mentioned it. Yes. Michael paused. There was also another meeting. With you. Correct. When? The following morning. Interesting. So Ethan wasn't the last person Grandpa met before he died. No. How was the last family member? Michael chose his words carefully. That would be accurate. I wrote it down immediately, not because it changed everything, because it changed one thing. And sometimes, one corrected fact forced every other assumption to move with it. Before ending the call, Michael added something unexpected. Arthur instructed me to review several archived files before our next meeting. Archived files? Yes. What kind? I believe you'll understand their importance soon. Can you tell me anything? A brief pause. I can tell you this. I'm listening. Your grandfather prepared for disagreement long before anyone knew there would be one. After hanging up, I stared at my notebook. Another piece had fallen into place. Not enough to reveal the full picture. Just enough to prove there was one. Friday afternoon, I returned to my office after meeting with a client. My assistant stepped into the doorway. Quinn. Yeah. A courier dropped this off. She handed me a large cream-colored envelope. No return address. Only my name. Inside was a single photocopy. One printed email. Nothing else. The sender was Arthur Chavez. The recipient was Michael Harper. The subject line read, Contingency package. Activate only if Quinn is accused of acting out of greed. I read the subject twice, then a third time. The body of the email had been intentionally covered by a sheet of black paper, leaving only one sentence visible at the bottom. If this instruction is ever needed, then my family has already proven the point I spent years trying to teach them. At the bottom of the page was Michael Harper's handwritten note. We'll discuss this at our next meeting. Please don't draw conclusions yet. I carefully slid the page back into the envelope. Whatever Grandpa had been building, IT hadn't begun during his final week. It had begun years earlier. I didn't sleep much that weekend, not because I was worried about the trust, because of one sentence. Activate only if Quinn is accused of acting out of greed. Grandpa hadn't simply anticipated that our family might argue. I had predicted the exact accusation, not dishonesty, not manipulation, greed. That wasn't coincidence, that was planning, as someone who investigated fraud for a living. I knew there was an important distinction between expecting conflict and designing procedures around it. Businesses created contingency plans because experience taught them what was likely to happen. Apparently, my grandfather had done the same thing with his own family. Monday morning, attorney Michael Harper called. We're reconvening this afternoon. So soon? Yes. Has something changed? No. His voice remained steady. It is simply time to continue following Arthur's instructions. At exactly 2 o'clock, everyone was back in the same conference room. Nothing had changed. The same polished table, the same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, the same leather folders waiting neatly in front of each chair. Only the atmosphere felt different. Mom barely looked at me. Natalie kept twisting her wedding ring around her finger. Ethan sat with his arms crossed, his confidence returning now that the shock of the funeral had begun to fade. Michael entered carrying 2 document boxes. Not 1, 2. He placed them carefully beside his chair. I appreciate everyone returning. No one answered. He opened the first box. Inside were several sealed envelopes arranged by date. Each one bore Grandpa Arthur's handwriting. My brother frowned. "How many letters did Grandpa leave?" Michael smiled politely. "More than one. I thought there was only the final note." "There is." "So, what are those?" "They are supporting instructions." Ethan looked irritated. "This is becoming ridiculous." Michael met his eyes calmly. "Your grandfather preferred precision." The lawyer picked up the first envelope. This letter was written approximately 5 years ago. He checked the date before continuing. "It contains no financial instructions." Mom looked confused. "Then why are we reading it?" "Because Arthur directed me to read it before discussing any distribution of trust assets." Ethan let out a slow breath. "So we're delaying everything." Michael ignored the interruption. He unfolded the letter carefully. "I'll read it exactly as written." The room became silent. Then Grandpa's words filled the conference room. "If you're hearing this letter, then something I hoped would never happen has happened." Michael paused only long enough to turn the page. "Someone in this room believes the trust is about winning." It isn't. The trust exists because wealth reveals habits that remain hidden when there isn't much at stake. Mom lowered her eyes. Natalie stopped fidgeting. Even Ethan looked uncomfortable. Michael continued reading. "I spent decades building houses. I discovered something that construction and families have in common. Weak foundations rarely collapse on sunny days. They fail during pressure." Nobody moved. I suddenly understood why Grandpa had wanted this letter read before anyone discussed numbers. I wasn't explaining his money. I was explaining his philosophy. Michael continued. "If you are wondering whether I trusted my family, the answer is yes. If you are wondering whether I trusted every decision my family would make after my death, the answer is no." Ethan leaned forward. "This still has nothing to do with the trust." Michael calmly looked up. "It has everything to do with the trust." Then he returned to the letter. "For years, I watched each of you. Not because I wanted perfect children or perfect grandchildren. Because I wanted to understand how each person responded when something valuable was involved. Time, attention, responsibility, money, respect. Those who believe this trust is only about dollars have already misunderstood why I created it." The room remained completely still. Ethan finally broke the silence. "So are we going to hear who gets what today or not?" His tone wasn't angry. It was impatient. Michael folded the letter carefully before answering. "We will. When? After Arthur's instructions have been completed." "This is unnecessary." Michael looked directly at him. "No, it isn't. You don't know that." "I do." "How?" "Because your grandfather explained exactly why he established this sequence." He reached into the box again. "There is another paragraph." He unfolded a second sheet attached to the first. "The first person who becomes frustrated that this meeting is taking too long should ask themselves one question. Am I grieving my family? Or am I grieving a financial expectation?" No one looked at Ethan. No one needed to. Mom finally spoke. "Dad never talked like this." Michael smiled faintly. "Actually, he spoke this way quite often." "What do you mean?" "He simply didn't speak this way in large family gatherings." Mom looked surprised. "You knew him that well?" "For 22 years. Michael rested both hands on the table. "Most people think my job was drafting legal documents. It wasn't. My real job was listening." Grandpa had apparently spent hundreds of hours talking with him, not only about investments, about people, about family dynamics, about patterns, about fear, about guilt, about obligation. He often repeated one sentence. Michael glanced at his notes. "The hardest inheritance to divide fairly isn't money." "What is it?" Natalie asked quietly. "Expectation." Michael opened the second document box. Unlike the first, this one contained thick binders instead of letters. Each binder carried a printed label. Meeting memoranda. Trust administration notes. Personal observations. Ethan's eyebrows pulled together. "What are those?" "Arthur instructed me to maintain contemporaneous records." For what purpose? So that no one would need to rely on memory. As a forensic accountant, I immediately appreciated the significance. Memory changed. Documentation didn't, Michael continued. These are not secret surveillance files. They are professional records. Whenever Arthur discussed major trust decisions, I documented his reasoning. Whenever amendments were executed, I documented his legal capacity. Whenever concerns arose, I documented our conversations. Mom looked stunned. You kept all that? It is standard practice. Then Michael added something important. Arthur specifically requested additional documentation during the last 6 years. The last 6 years, exactly the period when Ethan's financial problems had become more frequent. Exactly the period when Mom had increasingly relied on me to solve family crises. Exactly the period when Grandpa had started asking strange questions. None of that proved anything, but the timeline fit. Michael reached into the binder and removed another sealed envelope. This one looked newer. Across the front in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting were 8 words. Read only after the first letter has been finished. Michael looked around the room. Arthur anticipated that the first letter would leave questions unanswered. It certainly did, Mom whispered. He anticipated frustration. He anticipated disagreement. He anticipated that someone would still believe the discussion was about percentages. Ethan sighed loudly. It is about percentages. Michael slowly shook his head. No, it isn't. Without another word, he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He scanned the first line. For the first time since this process began, Attorney Michael Harper looked directly at me before saying, Quinn, this next instruction concerns you specifically. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Not because anyone expected good news, because Grandpa Arthur had somehow managed to become the center of the conversation even after his death. Attorney Michael Harper rested the newly opened page on the table before speaking. This section isn't a change to the trust. It isn't, Ethan asked. No. Then what is it? It's an explanation. He adjusted his glasses, and Arthur instructed me to read it exactly as written. Hanyabegan. If Michael is reading this page, Quinn has almost certainly become the easiest person to blame. No one moved. Families rarely assign responsibility fairly during conflict. They assign it to the person least likely to fight back. I stared at the tabletop. Grandpa had never said those words to me while he was alive. Yet they described my role in the family with painful accuracy. Michael continued. Quinn has spent most of her adult life solving problems that weren't hers. Some of you noticed. Most of you simply became accustomed to it. A quiet ache settled in my chest, not because Grandpa was praising me, because he had seen something I had spent years trying not to acknowledge. Michael lowered the page. I'd like to clarify something before I continue. Ethan folded his arms. Go ahead. Arthur asked me to distinguish between gratitude and dependence. Mom frowned. What does that mean? It means appreciating someone's help is different from expecting their help. He looked around the table. Arthur believed that line had gradually disappeared within this family. Nobody answered, because nobody could honestly disagree. The lawyer opened one of the thick binders labeled Meeting Memoranda. I'll be referencing a few entries. Ethan immediately leaned forward. So these are Grandpa's journals? No, my professional records. They're not the same thing. Not at all. Michael spoke patiently as though explaining the process to a jury. When clients make significant estate decisions, I document the context. Why? Because memories fade. People remember conversations differently, and written contemporaneous records often become important years later. That explanation made perfect sense to me. It was remarkably similar to the reports I prepared after financial investigations. The report wasn't the evidence. It organized the evidence. Michael opened to a bookmarked page. Meeting dated April 18th, approximately 4 years ago. I looked down and began reading. Arthur expressed concern that Quinn is increasingly viewed as the family's permanent problem solver. He worries that requests made in the name of love have become expectations. Mom slowly shook her head. I never expected. Michael gently raised a hand. Please, I'd like to finish, he continued. Arthur stated that Quinn rarely refuses because she mistakes responsibility for love. The words landed harder than I expected, because they were true. Not completely, but enough. I remembered vacations interrupted by emergency phone calls, weekends spent reviewing insurance paperwork, evenings explaining mortgage documents, hours helping Ethan untangle business records. None of those moments had felt extraordinary. Together, they had quietly become my identity. Michael turned another page. Meeting dated 11 months later. He read again. Arthur reports that Ethan requested financial assistance. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Michael continued. Arthur declined direct funding. Instead, Quinn reviewed the business records and identified accounting errors that prevented unnecessary lender penalties. Ethan looked confused. What? Michael kept reading. Arthur observed that Quinn refused compensation. She requested that Ethan never be told she had assisted unless circumstances required disclosure. The room became completely still. Ethan looked directly at me. You did that. I nodded once. You knew. I reviewed your financial statements. You never said anything. You asked for another opinion. So I gave you one. You saved the business. I corrected mistakes. They were the same thing. I shrugged. It wasn't something I wanted credit for. Ethan stared at me. I thought my accountant figured that out. I told him where to look. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly whispered, I never knew. I know. Natalie looked between us. Wait. So when Ethan thanked everyone at Mom's dinner, she stopped herself. I smiled gently. He didn't know. No, I wasn't pretending. I don't think so. For the first time since this process had begun, my anger toward Ethan shifted slightly. Not disappeared, shifted, because ignorance wasn't the same as manipulation. Someone could benefit from your work without realizing who made it possible. Grandpa had apparently understood that distinction years before I did. Michael opened another memorandum. This entry concerns Evelyn. Mom visibly stiffened. Do we really have to do this? Michael answered softly. Arthur believed honesty offered the only chance for healing. He read, Evelyn loves Quinn deeply. Mom's eyes immediately filled with tears. However, Michael paused only briefly. Love expressed through constant dependence eventually becomes unfair. Mom covered her mouth. Arthur worries. Evelyn increasingly assumes Quinn will absorb every inconvenience because Quinn rarely complains. Silence, then another sentence. Good intentions do not erase unhealthy patterns. Mom looked at me. I honestly never thought of it that way. I believed her. That was the hardest part. Manipulation wasn't always planned. Sometimes people simply adapted to whoever kept making life easier. Michael closed the memorandum. I'd like to clarify something else. He looked directly at all three of us. Arthur never asked me to judge anyone. He asked me to preserve context. So these aren't accusations, Natalie asked. No, they're observations. Based on years of conversations, and documented at the time they occurred. He gently tapped the binder. This is why he insisted on written records, so no one's memory would become the evidence. As a forensic accountant, I couldn't have explained it better myself. Evidence existed independently of emotion. That was precisely why it mattered. Michael reached for the final memorandum marked with a blue tab. I've delayed this one intentionally. Why? Ethan asked. Because Arthur believed it should only be read after everyone understood the pattern. He unfolded the page. This meeting occurred approximately 6 months before Arthur passed away. His expression became noticeably more serious. Today, I asked Quinn a hypothetical question. I immediately remembered lunch at the diner. I asked whether she would still do the right thing if every member of the family turned against her. My throat tightened. She answered without hesitation. Michael looked up. Arthur wrote Quinn's exact words. He continued reading. She said, "Doing the right thing doesn't become wrong just because it's lonely." I had forgotten saying that. Apparently, Grandpa never had. Michael slowly placed the page back into the binder. Then he looked toward the second document box. There is only one remaining category of records. Ethan exhaled. I don't think I like where this is going. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a sealed folder that was noticeably thinner than the others. Across the front, Arthur had written in bold black ink, "Read only if anyone claims Quinn influenced my estate decisions." For the second time that week, I realized my grandfather hadn't merely anticipated conflict. He had anticipated the exact arguments each person would make. No one reached for a glass of water. No one checked a phone. The room had grown so quiet that I could hear the faint clicking of the wall clock behind attorney Michael Harper. He rested one hand on the sealed folder. Across the front in Grandpa Arthur's unmistakable handwriting were the words none of us could ignore. Read only if anyone claims Quinn influenced my estate decisions. Ethan let out a slow breath. I never said she influenced Grandpa. Michael looked at him calmly. You haven't. Then why are we opening it? Because Arthur instructed me to, but nobody accused Quinn of manipulating him. Michael held Ethan's gaze. No, not directly. He paused. But Arthur believed that accusation would eventually become unavoidable if the trust produced an outcome someone disliked. The sentence settled over the room like heavy rain. Grandpa hadn't written this because he distrusted us. He wrote it because he understood human nature. When disappointment searched for an explanation, people often looked for someone to blame. Michael broke the seal. Inside wasn't another handwritten letter. It was a typed memorandum. Attached behind it were several documents. He adjusted the papers into a neat stack. This memorandum was dictated by Arthur approximately 3 years before his death. He began reading, "If you're hearing this, then someone has likely suggested or privately wondered that Quinn somehow influenced my estate planning because of her financial background." I felt my shoulders tighten, not because I had ever feared that accusation, because I realized Grandpa had carried this concern long before I knew it existed. Michael continued, "Let me answer that question myself. No, Quinn has never requested a larger share. She has never asked to review my trust. She has never suggested how I should divide my estate. In fact, whenever I attempted to discuss details, she consistently redirected the conversation elsewhere." Natalie slowly looked toward me. "Is that true?" I nodded. I didn't want to know. "Why?" "Because it wasn't my decision." Michael lifted the first attachment. This is a memorandum from one of Arthur's annual trust review meetings. I glanced at the date. 4 years ago, he read aloud. Client attempted to explain current distribution philosophy to granddaughter Quinn Chavez. Granddaughter politely interrupted and stated she preferred not to know any details that might affect family relationships. A faint smile crossed Michael's face. I remember that meeting. "You do?" I asked. He nodded. "Very clearly. What happened?" Arthur spent nearly 10 minutes trying to explain the structure. "And? You finally said?" He looked down at his notes. "Grandpa, if I don't know what's in the trust, nobody can accuse me of asking for it." I barely remembered saying it, but hearing it now, it sounded exactly like something I would have said. Michael smiled again. Arthur laughed for almost a full minute. Mom lowered her eyes. "I had no idea." "Neither did I," Natalie whispered. Ethan shifted uneasily in his chair. "So Quinn never knew anything?" Michael answered immediately. "No, nothing. Only what Arthur chose to tell every member of the family." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "I honestly thought—" He stopped himself. "What?" I asked quietly. "I thought maybe—" I looked embarrassed. "I thought maybe Grandpa trusted you more because you understood finances." Michael answered before I could. "He did trust Quinn." Ethan looked up. "So I was right." Michael gently shook his head, for the wrong reason. "What do you mean?" "He didn't trust Quinn because she understood accounting." "Then why?" "Because she consistently refused opportunities that could have created conflicts of interest. The distinction mattered a great deal. As a forensic accountant, One of the first lessons I learned was that integrity wasn't demonstrated after a conflict appeared. It was demonstrated by avoiding unnecessary conflicts before they ever existed. Apparently, Grandpa had noticed. Michael picked up another document. This one concerns an incident Arthur specifically wanted preserved. I looked toward me. I believe you know exactly which incident this is. I frowned. I don't. I think you will. He began reading. Approximately 27 months ago, Ethan experienced significant financial pressure related to lender compliance. Ethan looked confused. I remember. Arthur contacted Quinn without Ethan's knowledge. I stared at Michael. I thought Grandpa only asked if I could look over some numbers. He did. Michael continued reading. Quinn identified material accounting errors that, if corrected promptly, would likely prevent default. Ethan slowly leaned back. My God. Michael wasn't finished. Arthur offered Quinn financial compensation for her professional work. I remembered that part. Grandpa had tried to hand me a check. I never accepted it. Michael read the next sentence. Quinn declined payment and requested complete confidentiality to avoid embarrassing Ethan. Mom looked at me in disbelief. You wouldn't even let your grandfather pay you. I shook my head. He asked for help. You spent almost an entire weekend reviewing those records. I know. You could have charged thousands. I wasn't his consultant. I was his granddaughter. Ethan stared silently at the table. Finally, he spoke. I always wondered how everything suddenly came together. I looked at me. I thought my accountant worked some kind of miracle. He corrected the entries. Because you showed him where they were. I nodded. He covered his face with both hands. I've spent over 2 years thanking the wrong person. No, I answered softly. You thanked the person who implemented the corrections. But I never thanked you. You couldn't. You didn't know. I looked up again. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about the answer before speaking. Because helping someone shouldn't become leverage. He blinked several times, then quietly said, I don't think I would have done the same. I know. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply the truth. Michael carefully placed the memorandum back into the folder. Arthur included a personal observation after this incident. He began reading again. Quinn continues solving problems without seeking recognition. I worry this strength may eventually become the very reason others stop seeing her sacrifices. That sentence reached somewhere I hadn't expected. There is a strange loneliness that comes with being dependable. At first, people appreciate it. Later, they assume it. Eventually, they stop noticing it altogether. Not because they're cruel, because consistency becomes invisible. Grandpa had seen that happen to me. I hadn't. Michael looked around the room before opening the final attachment inside the folder. This is the last document concerning Quinn's relationship with Arthur. He unfolded a single page. Unlike everything else, this one wasn't typed. It was handwritten. Arthur's handwriting looked slightly shakier than usual, likely written during his final year. Michael read slowly. Quinn. If you're hearing this, then Michael has probably spent hours explaining decisions you never asked me to defend. A weak smile appeared despite the heaviness in my chest. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. Practical, direct, almost amused, Michael continued. There is one thing I need you to understand. I never admired you because you were successful. I admired you because success never became permission for you to believe other people owed you something. Tears blurred my vision. Please don't allow anyone to convince you that asking my trust to be honored is selfish. The selfish act would be asking my wishes to disappear because following them makes someone uncomfortable. No one spoke. Not Mom, not Natalie, not Ethan. Grandpa had just drawn a line so clear that none of us could pretend not to see it. Michael carefully folded the handwritten page. I have one final item. He reached into the bottom of the folder and removed a slim envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Its label was different from every other document we had seen. There was no condition, no explanation, only 6 handwritten words. Read after everyone hears the truth. Michael looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he quietly said, I believe This is the document Arthur considered the most important of all. No one urged Michael Harper to hurry this time. The impatience that had filled the room 2 days earlier had disappeared, not because anyone suddenly enjoyed probate law, because the meeting had stopped being about inheritance. It had become a mirror, and none of us particularly liked what we saw reflected back. Michael held the dark blue envelope for several seconds before carefully breaking the wax seal. Inside was a single folded sheet. No legal language, no trust provisions, no attachments. Just Grandpa Arthur's handwriting. He looked at each of us before beginning. If Michael has reached this letter, then the facts have already been explained. Now I would like to explain my heart. His words landed differently than the memoranda. The earlier documents had sounded like evidence. This one sounded like a grandfather speaking to the people he loved one final time. To my daughter Evelyn. Mom immediately lowered her head. Michael continued, "You have always loved your children. I have never questioned that." Tears rolled quietly down Mom's cheeks. But love is not measured only by sacrifice. It is also measured by fairness. Michael paused briefly. For years, you believed Quinn needed you the least because she complained the least. Mom covered her face. You mistook strength for unlimited capacity. Every time Quinn quietly solved another family problem, you became a little more comfortable asking her to solve the next one. You never intended to hurt her, but intention does not erase impact. Mom whispered almost to herself. I never saw it. Nobody answered, because the letter already had. Michael continued reading. One afternoon, Evelyn asked me which grandchild worried me the most. Mom slowly looked up. I remember that conversation. Michael nodded. So do I, he continued. She expected me to answer Ethan because of his business failures, or Natalie because she avoided conflict. Instead, I answered Quinn. Mom began crying harder, not because Quinn was weak, because she had become too comfortable carrying burdens that belonged to other people. I felt my throat tighten. There had been countless evenings when I drove home exhausted after solving someone else's emergency. Not once had I considered whether it was actually mine to solve. I simply assumed that was what daughters did. That was what sisters did. That was what family meant. Grandpa had seen something I couldn't. Helping wasn't the problem. Believing I was responsible for everyone else's stability was. Michael turned to the next section. To Ethan. My brother straightened slightly. You inherited my optimism. A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. Then Michael continued. Unfortunately, you also inherited my belief that another opportunity would always appear. The smile disappeared. There is nothing shameful about failure. There is danger only when failure becomes someone else's recurring responsibility. Ethan stared at the letter without blinking. You often thanked people who applauded your recovery. You rarely stopped to ask who quietly built the bridge that allowed you to cross. The sentence struck him visibly. He slowly looked toward me, not defensively, not angrily, simply with realization. I honestly didn't know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I believe you, I answered. And I did, because ignorance had carried enough consequences already. There was no reason to invent motives that weren't there. Michael resumed reading. If you truly wish to honor me, stop asking whether Quinn loves this family. Begin asking whether this family has loved Quinn in ways she could actually feel. The room became painfully quiet. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question. One none of us could answer honestly. I thought back over birthdays, Christmas mornings, Sunday dinners, family vacations. There had been affection. There had been laughter. There had also been an invisible assumption. If something went wrong, Quinn would fix it. That expectation had become so normal that no one noticed its weight, least of all me. Michael reached the final section addressed to Natalie. My dear Natalie, peace purchased through silence is rarely peace. Natalie closed her eyes. You have spent much of your life preventing arguments. Sometimes that was wise. Sometimes it required allowing unfairness to continue because confronting it felt uncomfortable. Natalie wiped away a tear. I deserve that, Michael continued. Neutrality is not always kindness. Sometimes neutrality quietly supports the strongest voice in the room. Natalie nodded without speaking. I suddenly remembered dozens of family dinners. Whenever Ethan and Mom disagreed with me, Natalie usually changed the subject. She never joined them. She never defended me either. At the time, I appreciated that she wasn't attacking me. Now I realized silence had still left me standing alone. Michael gently folded the letter. I believe Arthur wanted all three of you to hear those words together. Nobody responded immediately. Finally, Mom looked directly at me. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't defending Ethan. She wasn't asking me to understand. She simply looked tired. I owe you an apology. I waited. I've apologized before when I was wrong. She swallowed. But this feels different. How? I thought I treated all three of you equally. She shook her head slowly. I didn't. No. I treated each of you according to what I believed you could handle. I listened quietly. And because I believed you could handle almost anything, I kept giving you more. She wiped her eyes. I honestly thought I was trusting your strength. I nodded. I know. I wasn't trying to punish you. I know. She looked relieved for a brief moment. Then I continued. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. She closed her eyes again. I understand that now. For the first time, I believed she actually did. A long silence settled over the conference room. Eventually, Mom spoke again. Quinn, would you consider something? What? She hesitated. I know what Dad wanted. I waited. I know the trust should be followed. Another pause. But there it was. The word I had been expecting. But she looked toward Ethan. Would you consider giving up part of your share anyway? Not because Grandpa wanted it. Not because the trust required it. Simply so the family doesn't have to keep carrying this. I stared at her, not angry, not surprised, just profoundly sad. Even after everything, even after every letter, every memorandum, every documented observation, her first instinct was still the same. Ask Quinn to carry a little more. Before I could answer, Michael quietly closed the trust binder. I think, he said carefully, Arthur anticipated this conversation as well. He reached beneath the table and removed one final document case that none of us had noticed before. Unlike every previous folder, this one contained no letters, only the official trust instrument itself. Several pages had colored tabs attached to specific sections. Michael rested his hand on the cover. I believe it's finally time to explain what Arthur actually decided. For the first time since Grandpa Arthur's funeral, no one interrupted attorney Michael Harper. Not even Ethan. The room had been transformed. 3 days earlier, everyone had arrived expecting a routine reading of a trust. Instead, we'd spent hours confronting years of habits that none of us had fully recognized while Grandpa was alive. Michael placed the bound trust agreement in front of him. This, he said, resting his hand on the cover, is the legal document Arthur signed. He looked around the room. Everything we've discussed until now explains why he made his decisions. He paused. What I'm about to explain is what those decisions actually are. Michael opened the binder to the first colored tab. As everyone knows, Arthur Chavez created a revocable living trust after selling Chavez Custom Builders. He looked toward Mom. During his lifetime, he remained the trustee. She nodded. After his passing, administration transferred according to the trust. Ethan leaned forward. So, who controls everything now? Michael smiled politely. Not a family member. Ethan frowned. Why not? Arthur deliberately appointed an independent professional fiduciary. He looked down at this document. Lake Michigan Fiduciary Services. I nodded quietly. That made perfect sense. An independent trustee removed emotion from the process. No sibling could accuse another of manipulating the estate. No child could pressure a parent. Everything would be governed by the written instructions. Grandpa had eliminated the possibility of personal influence before it could even begin. Michael turned another page. The trust directs that specific charitable gifts are made first. Mom smiled faintly. Your father always said the community helped build his business. He remembered, Michael continued. Several local scholarships, a veterans housing nonprofit, the children's hospital where Grandpa had volunteered after retirement. Then came the family provisions. No dollar amounts were read aloud. Instead, Michael summarized the structure. The trust provides distributions to Arthur's descendants, according to predetermined percentages established years ago. Ethan immediately asked, So they're fixed? Yes. They were never changed. Michael answered without hesitation. The percentages relevant to the grandchildren have remained unchanged since the final amendment was executed. I noticed Ethan blink. So, nothing changed because of the last few weeks? No. Nothing changed because of Quinn? No. Nothing changed because of our argument? No. Michael folded his hands. Arthur made these decisions long before his illness. The room grew quiet again. Grandpa hadn't reacted emotionally. I had planned carefully, patiently, years in advance. Mom finally spoke. So, why all the letters? Michael looked at her kindly. Because Arthur feared something much more than lawsuits. What? Resentment. He let the word linger. He believed money eventually stops hurting, but broken families often don't. I don't think he expected the letters to prevent disagreement. I believe he hoped they would prevent misunderstanding. I thought about that for a moment. I wasn't trying to convince everyone to like the outcome. I wanted everyone to understand how he had reached it. Those were two completely different goals. Michael turned to another tab. There is one provision Arthur specifically instructed me to explain. I looked toward me. This concerns Quinn. I felt every pair of eyes return to me. The trust contains no reward for acting as family caretaker. Mom immediately lowered her gaze. Michael continued. Arthur specifically prohibited me from increasing or decreasing anyone's inheritance based upon unpaid help provided within the family. Ethan looked confused. Why? Michael answered. Because Arthur believed love should never become billable. That sentence made something inside me soften. Grandpa hadn't been secretly compensating me. I hadn't tried to balance every sacrifice with money. I believe those sacrifices should never have been necessary in the first place. Michael continued. Arthur wrote. He glanced at a note attached to the trust. If Quinn ever receives more, let it be because I freely chose it, not because she kept solving everyone else's problems. I closed my eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like him. I had protected something I hadn't even realized needed protecting. My worth. He refused to let it be measured by everything I had quietly carried. Ethan cleared his throat. I need to say something. No one interrupted him. He looked directly at me. I've been thinking about everything Michael read. I waited. I kept replaying that lunch when I brought you my financial statements. He laughed bitterly. I walked into your office believing I was asking for a tiny favor. You were. No. He shook his head. I wasn't. I asked you to solve a problem I should have been paying someone to solve. He looked down at his hands. And then? I stood at Mom's dining room table taking credit for surviving. You didn't know. I know. But ignorance doesn't erase what happened. His voice cracked slightly. I've spent years believing I succeeded entirely on my own. I didn't, I answered softly. You still had to rebuild the business. He looked surprised. What? I didn't build your company. I only pointed out where it was bleeding. You still had to do the work. For the first time in days. He smiled. A small one. A genuine one. Thank you. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was simply honest. I should have said that years ago. Natalie leaned toward me. I'm sorry, too. You don't owe me everything. I do. She shook her head. I always thought staying neutral made me fair. It didn't. No. It made things easier for me. She smiled sadly. And harder for you. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I appreciate you saying that. She squeezed back. I'll try to do better. I believe you. Then everyone looked at Mom. She sat silently for almost a minute. Finally, she spoke. I don't expect forgiveness today. I nodded. Okay. I also don't expect things to go back to normal. They can't. No. She took a deep breath. But I need you to hear something. I waited. You spent years believing I loved you less. A tear rolled down her cheek. I didn't. I loved you differently. I let the silence remain between us. Then I answered honestly. I know. She looked relieved. But, I continued, it still wasn't fair. She nodded immediately. No, it wasn't. For the first time in my adult life, neither of us tried to explain away the truth. The meeting concluded a few minutes later. Michael reviewed the remaining administrative steps: tax filings, property transfers, distribution schedules, routine legal procedures. Nothing unexpected. As everyone gathered their belongings, Ethan walked beside me toward the elevator. I've been thinking. Dangerous hobby, he laughed. Probably. Then he became serious again. I don't want you fixing things for me anymore. I looked at him. I wasn't planning to. I know, he smiled. But if I ever ask, you'll say no, I smiled back. If it's your responsibility, yes, I probably will. Instead of looking offended, he nodded. I think Grandpa would have liked that answer. So do I. I expected the meeting to end there. Instead, as I reached the lobby doors, Michael called after me. Quinn. I turned around. I was carrying a small wooden box no larger than a hardcover novel. I almost forgot. And handed it to me. The trust required this to remain sealed until administration was complete. I looked down. A brass plate was attached to the lid. Only 4 words were engraved. For Quinn, open alone. Michael smiled gently. Arthur was very specific. I ran my fingers across the smooth wood. Do you know what's inside? I do. You won't tell me. He shook his head. No. Why not? Because... He smiled in exactly the same way Grandpa used to. Some conversations belong only between a grandfather, and his granddaughter. I carried the box to my car without opening it. For the first time in days, I wasn't afraid of what I might find inside. I was simply ready to hear Grandpa's voice one last time. I didn't open the wooden box when I got home. I set it on my kitchen table and simply looked at it. For nearly 20 minutes. Outside my condominium window, the Chicago skyline glowed under the fading light of early evening. The city kept moving. Sirens echoed in the distance. Trains rattled across elevated tracks. Thousands of people were finishing ordinary Mondays. My life, however, no longer felt ordinary. Not because of the trust. Because for the first time in years, I couldn't remember the last time I had felt responsible for fixing someone else's life. That realization was strangely unsettling. I made myself a cup of tea, sat down, and finally lifted the lid. Inside was only one envelope. No jewelry, no cash, no legal documents, no hidden deed, just one folded letter. On the front, in Grandpa Arthur's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words. My last lesson. I smiled through tears. Even now, he was still teaching. I unfolded the pages carefully. Dear Quinn, if you're reading this, Michael has finished his job. Now it's my turn to finish mine. I took a slow breath and continued. You probably think this box contains your real inheritance. It doesn't. Your inheritance was never inside this box. It was every conversation we shared, while you were too busy believing we were simply talking about gardening, baseball, or old construction projects. A tear slipped onto the paper. I laughed quietly as I wiped it away. That sounded exactly like him. He had hidden life's biggest lessons inside ordinary afternoons. When you were 12, you insisted on helping me rebuild the fence behind my workshop. I smiled immediately. I remembered that day. The boards were heavier than I expected. The nails kept bending because I was swinging the hammer sideways. I had become frustrated and asked Grandpa why he refused to help. Instead of taking the hammer, he'd simply adjusted my grip. You wanted me to finish the fence for you. Instead, I taught you how to hold the hammer. You were annoyed. Years later, you thanked me. Another smile. I had forgotten that memory completely. Real love does not remove every difficulty. It prepares someone to face difficulty without losing themselves. I continued reading. Somewhere along the way, our family confused love with rescue. Whenever someone struggled, you stepped forward. At first, that was generous. Eventually, it became expected. Then it became invisible. I stopped reading for a moment. Those 3 sentences explained nearly a decade of my adult life better than I ever could. Grandpa wasn't criticizing me for helping. He was showing me where generosity had quietly crossed into self-neglect. The next paragraph felt almost painfully personal. There is something I have wanted to tell you for years. You are allowed to disappoint people who benefit from your lack of boundaries. I stared at those words, then read them again. And again. How many decisions had I made because I feared disappointing someone? How many weekends had disappeared because saying no felt selfish? How many apologies had I offered simply because another person was unhappy with my answer? Grandpa had understood before I ever did. Sometimes disappointment wasn't evidence that you had done something wrong. Sometimes it was evidence that someone else expected too much. Near the end of the letter, Grandpa wrote something that made me cry harder than anything else. When your grandmother was alive, she once asked me which grandchild reminded me most of her. I answered without hesitation, "You!" I laughed through my tears. Grandma Elena had passed away when I was 14. I still remembered the way she hugged people with both arms. The way she always packed leftovers for neighbors before thinking about herself. The way she somehow knew exactly when someone was pretending to be okay. Your grandmother loved generously. She also learned much later in life that generosity without boundaries eventually attracts people who mistake kindness for obligation. She hoped you would learn that lesson earlier than she did. I hope I have helped. I placed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't grieving the trust. I was grieving the years I had spent believing my value came from being useful. 6 months passed. The trust was administered exactly as Grandpa had instructed. There were no lawsuits, no dramatic courtroom battles, no shocking reversals. Only paperwork, signatures, transfers, taxes. The ordinary work that follows a carefully written estate plan. What changed wasn't the legal outcome. It was the relationships. Ethan never again asked me to solve one of his business problems. Instead, he occasionally called to tell me about mistakes he'd fixed himself. The first time he did that, I smiled for the rest of the day. Not because he no longer needed me, because he no longer expected me to rescue him. Natalie changed too. One evening, she called after disagreeing with Mom about something. I finally said what I actually thought. How did it go? Messy. I laughed. Sometimes messy is healthier than silent. I think Grandpa would have agreed. So do I. Mom's change came more slowly. Years of habit don't disappear overnight. A few times she almost slipped back into old patterns. Quinn, since you're so good at... Then she'd stop herself, smile awkwardly. And actually, I can figure this one out. The first few times felt strange. Then they began to feel normal. One Saturday, she invited me to lunch. Halfway through the meal, she reached across the table. I've been trying to understand something. What? You always looked so calm. I wasn't. You never complained. I didn't know how. She nodded sadly. I mistook your silence for ease. It wasn't. I know that now. Neither of us cried. We didn't need to. Healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's simply two people finally describing the same memory honestly. The following spring, I drove alone to Grandpa Arthur's grave. The cemetery overlooked a quiet stretch of trees just outside the city. I brought fresh white lilies, his favorite. I stood there for several minutes before speaking. You were right. The breeze moved softly through the branches. I thought protecting everyone else was what made me a good daughter. I smiled. It turns out protecting myself made me a healthier one. I placed my hand lightly against the cool granite. The trust didn't change our family. It revealed it. And because it revealed it, it gave us a chance to become something better. Not perfect, better. I thanked him for every quiet conversation we'd ever shared, for every question he had asked instead of every answer he could have given, for trusting me enough not to rescue me from lessons I needed to learn myself. As I walked back toward my car, I didn't feel like someone who had won an inheritance. I felt like someone who had finally stopped carrying a weight that had never belonged to her. Grandpa had left me money. He had also left me something infinitely more valuable. Permission. Permission to love my family without sacrificing myself. Permission to forgive without surrendering healthy boundaries. Permission to choose fairness over guilt. And permission to understand that protecting someone's access to you is not the same thing as loving them. That became the inheritance I carried home. The trust eventually became part of my financial future. Grandpa's final lesson became part of who I was. For a long time, I believed that loving my family meant saying yes, fixing problems, keeping the peace, and making sure no one felt disappointed. What I eventually learned is that love without boundaries slowly becomes obligation, and obligation can quietly erase the person giving it. There is an important difference between forgiveness and restored access. You can forgive someone for how they treated you while still deciding they no longer have unlimited access to your time, your energy, or your peace. Healthy boundaries are not punishment. They are protection for relationships that have a chance to become healthier and distance from those that refuse to change. If you've ever been called selfish, simply because you ask to be treated fairly, I hope this story reminds you that fairness and greed are not the same thing. Standing up for yourself does not mean you love your family less. Sometimes it means you finally love yourself enough to stop carrying burdens that were never yours. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been expected to be the responsible one in your family? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who is facing the same struggle. And if stories about family resilience, justice, and healing resonate with you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined this community. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.